Can you all hear me? Yep. 50 years is a very long time in anyone's life. Preparing to give a talk here today has had me scavenging in cupboards looking for old photos or memorabilia of those first years at Peakhurst High School, before computers, before the internet, even before cheap photocopiers, but not before education, nor before friendships, much admired and less admired teachers, the intensely social pleasures of the playground and of sport. I'll quote from a few of those early documents in a minute as I recall those early days. But first, maybe it's worth recalling that Peakhurst was one of the 20-odd new high schools built around the same time, 1963, for a grand new phase in higher education, in secondary education in New South Wales. It was to be a very large-scale social experiment. The Wyndham scheme of 1961 provided for a new public system of comprehensive, also co-educational high schools. The teachers and parents in 1964 must have been more aware than us students of how things were changing and how daring the change would be. And over the years, I've met so many people of roughly my own age whose backgrounds exactly parallel mine and can be traced back to that Wyndham scheme. They'll typically be, like me, the first member of their family to have stayed at school beyond the age of 15 and then to have gone on to a high school certificate. Their fathers and mothers wouldn't have dreamed of it, nor was it likely even for their older brothers and sisters educated during the pre-Wyndham scheme years. There simply weren't many public high schools that took children on beyond the intermediate certificate at age 15. Nor did they aim to provide such a comprehensive form of education as the new high schools would. Only a small number of high schools prepared students in those days, in the pre-Wyndham days, for university. And that was true right through until the end of the 1950s, even in the large cities. And then, during the 1960s, there was suddenly this generation staying at school till 18, and then, till 16, and then increasingly till 18. And then an increasing percentage of them over the years getting to university, first on scholarships, and then after 1972 studying at university for free. A small percentage of those students at uni subsequently went on to higher degrees. I was one of them. To my parents, it was almost miraculous. Neither of them had stayed at school long enough to even get their intermediate certificate. And when you think about it, that change happened in one generation. Anyway, reflecting on this remarkable fact has made me think more kindly about the first principal of Peakhurst High, Mr. White, who I've just learned today is no longer with us. Unlike many of the teachers in 1964, teachers who were mainly younger than him, he struck us kids as aloof, formal and unapproachable. He called every one of us by our surnames. So I was Eggert, whereas all the other teachers called me Paul. He would go on about civic duties and responsibilities, which seemed impossibly old-fashioned to us in the 1960s, a period when individual freedoms and liberation of all kinds were in the air. Yet I have to say that reading through a few of Mr. White's reports to parents this last week, because I found them in the cupboard too, makes me realise what an altruistic and committed educational builder he must have been. We started off in early 1964 with only one building, which I see is still called A building, at the top, plus the canteen over there. They were the only two that were actually completed and functioning. Getting the second and third buildings, B and D, on either side of the tarred playground finished and opened, and then securing resources from the Department of Education for the science equipment for the 4 labs, and also books for the library, and paying for the textbooks that would be issued annually to us students, and getting the financial and other support of the P&C Association and the Ladies Auxiliary, then having to devise and crank up every routine of the school year from scratch, must have needed not only commitment and hard work, but also a sense of daring. And I mean, in saying daring, the belief that a new phase in secondary education could actually be made to happen right here in this school, at this high school. The teachers who worked under Mr. White in those first years must have been terrific too. Building something substantial from scratch is a privilege that often brings out the best in people. They get a sense of ownership. And I think we students in those days profited from that. In our intense and insulated little worlds, we probably underappreciated their efforts. I was never sad that I didn't go to a private school. My parents had somewhat apprehensively, because of the cost, offered me that opportunity because they could see I was bright and that I might profit by it. But I said no, and I've never regretted it. It's been known for quite a while that private schooling has no effect on results at university beyond the first year, and some very recent research is suggesting now that, nowadays at least, it seems to have no effect on subsequent jobs and levels of pay either. Now, as a boy, I had no inkling of the effort that must have been happening behind the scenes at Peakhurst High, though perhaps my parents did. On that very first day, in early 1964, as some people in the audience will remember, about 250 of us gathered over there in the school canteen, which was the only indoor assembly hall we had. I guess we were all looking anxiously to see which of our friends would have shown up on that morning, friends from our existing primary schools. The anxieties of the playground loomed. You know, would you make any new friends? What was the pecking order amongst the boys? And then, as the years rolled by and the hormones were stirring, the teasing and the sexual politics that kept us all alert, boys and girls both. We boys were kept amused by the constant struggle between the girls' mistress, Mrs. Noonan, I think it was, and then I think Mrs. Calvert, to keep the hemline of the girls' uniform from being hitched up above the knee. And this was the 1960s, in the first age of the miniskirt. Well, you'll see, of course, teachers had a losing battle. The year that the school opened was also, of course, the same one in which the Beatles first visited Australia. Now, I remember there were 39 children in Class 1A that year, 1964. Between us, we managed to produce a newsletter of several Romeo pages using green ink. In those days, everything here at Peakhurst High seemed to be printed in green ink. Green, of course, for Peakhurst's original forests, which the name Forest Road still memorialises. The newsletter anyway, was optimistically called the Monthly Mag. But my cupboard produces no evidence that it proceeded beyond the first issue. And now it may have, I just don't remember. The first issue says that I was the editor. I've forgotten this entirely. But I see now that for me, as things would turn out, the die was already cast. And as for the Beatles, they were there in the Monthly Mag, a green drawing of the four of them with their long hair. Gasp horror in those days, long hair. The girls loved it. Anyway, I said the die was cast for me in that newsletter, and I could perhaps explain that a little better by saying that of all the teachers I admired in later years, and the one who inspired what few talents I had was the English and then history master, Mr. Nolan. Yeah. Other people remember him affectionately too, I'm sure. Jack Nolan, I think he was, to his colleagues. I have one document still in his handwriting. It's a reference he wrote for me in August 1969. The sentences are nicely controlled, confident, manly. The reference says the right things up front, leaving mention of my mediocre sporting achievements wisely until last. Now, I still remember Mr. Nolan's writing continuously in white chalk on the wide blackboard for a whole 40-minute period, and then for the next period, and then for the next one, writing what he modestly called the notes that he wanted us to have. He wanted us to have his notes, whether it was about a Shakespeare play or a Samuel Beckett play or some John Donne's poetry. He wanted to convey those notes. But nowadays educators, I think, would be aghast at the old-fashioned technique. Writing on the blackboard, having the children copy it out. How passive, they might say. Yet, as he wrote, my memory is that we didn't talk much, and what he wrote weren't strictly notes. They were very well-formed sentences. And I suspect what was happening is that we were absorbing his model. And at least for me, As I copied them out, I felt every one of those sentences, as Wordsworth says, along the blood. I wanted to be able to write like him. Language can be a beautiful and indeed a powerful thing if done well, and I learnt that lesson right here, and I've further pursued it and deepened it in my career ever since. There were other teachers I remember fondly, such as Mr. Bone, kindly Mr. Bone I thought he was, the deputy principal and teacher of Latin, who also struggled with the timetable in those pre-computer days. There was Miss Nielsen, our German teacher, whom we called Mutti, ironically but affectionately when she'd let us, and Mutti is German for mummy. Mr. Bamber was our science teacher in the early days. For some weeks I remember he patiently countered the arguments of a very articulate student who believed in creationism and who refused to accept the scientific theory of evolution. Mr. Bamber was so patient with him. Later I remember a lot of fun with the science master, Mr. Nelson, who taught us well. There was Mrs. King G in English and music, and later the impossibly aged, as we saw him then, the impossibly aged Mr. Ethel, who wrote the school song. We were made to sing that song with its embarrassing sentiments as though we believed them at public events such as speech nights and the annual induction of prefects, along with the national anthem, of course, which was God Save the Queen. But sometimes, and thankfully, as I can see from the programs now, it was balanced out with a more democratic waltzing Matilda. Singing and writing was encouraged in those days, as today I see from walking around the buildings, and we sometimes rose to the occasion willingly, sometimes not so willingly. If you have a look back at the annual school magazine that Neil Harries mentioned, Benbuka, which started I think in 1967, you'll find lots of poems and little prose compositions written by the students. Many of my friends, my school friends, appear in print there, and doubtless their first publications. But do these works of budding genius appear on their CVs now? I wonder. I doubt it somehow. But perhaps they'll make it into their memoirs, those compositions, if my friends ever write a memoir for their grandchildren. More likely their sporting achievements will rise to the top of the memoir, doubtless polished and enhanced. I'm afraid I've got nothing to crow about in the sporting department. The issue of Benbuka for 1969 notes my name as one of the better hockey players in the final that we alas narrowly lost to Peakhurst High. But I have no memory of ever having played particularly well. The best you could say of me, I'm afraid, is that I showed up and I gave it a go. The writer of the hockey article must have been one of my friends, surely. So it's been odd and nostalgic this week, looking through these materials excavated from the back of the cupboard, the photos especially. Sadly, I haven't kept in touch with my school friends, mainly because I haven't lived in Sydney for 40 years. So I was looking very intently at those class photos, and the names of many of the friends came back to me almost magically, and almost as if those people would still be the same today as they were then. There's something miraculous about the document or the photo from the actual time that memory can't top. You know, you remember one set of things, and then there are the documents and the photos telling you another. Being here today in the buildings, and including in this new building, which is great, being in the old buildings today, in which I've not set foot since the late 1960s, but which, funnily enough, have returned sometimes in my dreams, it's been a disorienting pleasure. The school belongs obviously to new generations of children now, but briefly today, my own part in it and that of my school friends and teachers sort of half comes back to life again, 50 years after the events. Well, obviously enough, I won't be around for the centenary celebration at Peakhurst High, but I hope many of the younger people here will be. And perhaps one of you will be giving this speech. Which of you will it be? And what will you say? I hope you'll be able to report that the second 50 years built on the first 50, and that this public school continued to serve its community and to educate its students faithfully and well. And finally, that you too feel some of the fondness that I feel today, looking back at those first half dozen years in the 1960s.